Hi, I'm John Foster from battleground.eu, and I'm here today with Peter Salmon, author of this really fascinating new book, an event perhaps, a biography of Jacques Derrida, which is out on Verso Books. We're really excited to be able to talk to Peter about the book and about Jacques Derrida and about modern politics. So thank you for coming on with us.
And I'm very excited to be here. It's fantastic. Thank you so much.
So what is it that led you to write a book about Derrida? I mean, he's a notoriously obscure, a notoriously opaque type writer. So what was it that led you to the topic in the first place?
Yeah, well, to be honest, it was a fairly banal thing. I was looking for an article for an essay, an idea for an essay type article, and I noticed it was 30 years since he'd given his speech at Baltimore, which I'm sure we'll come back to at some point. And I remember doing Derrida when I was at university, and I'd done a bit, and sort of he'd become part of my intellectual toolkit, as I think he does for so many people. But I hadn't approached him for a long time because, as many of your listeners, viewers will know, he's quite hard. So after you've read him for a while, you tend to have to step back from Derrida, which I had done. But going back to his work, I just found it absolutely compelling. Stuff on politics and ethics and so forth, which I hadn't really encountered at the time, but also just the breadth of his knowledge and the way his thinking really went back to the start of philosophy and throughout philosophy, and what a close reader he was. So having done that, I was fortunate enough to be asked to write the book, and it just became this wonderful journey into, I think, one of the great philosophers of the 20th century, and he's such a relevant person at the moment. With that, again, I'm sure we'll talk about this post-truth and intersectionality and all of those sort of things. So he really is incredibly relevant to today, I think.
Yeah, so he's a fascinating character, just in the respect that he's in a way kind of the quintessential outsider in French intellectual life, to the extent that you can be, having been a graduate of the École Normale Supérieure, which is, you know, for people who might not know, the sort of predominant or one of the predominant French intellectual institutions. The alumni list of which is essentially a who's who of French intellectual life.
Yes, Sartre, Beauvoir, Simone Weil, on and on it goes. Yes, absolutely.
But so, how do you think? You know, he's born in Algiers in 1930.
Yes.
He gets into the ENS sort of at the second time of asking, I think.
Yes, yeah, which is also traditional. Sartre did the same thing, I believe. So yes,
that's true. Yeah, and and he seems to have problems with his exams, although he's a very precocious student, clearly. But he doesn't seem to want to sort of go through the normal channels, if you want to say. Like he seems to be someone whose thinking is very, or whose sort of development is very self-motivated.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, I think the thing with him is one, you know, he was, when he arrived in Paris from Algiers, he was overwhelmed and very depressed and all of those things. Some of that is because he's Jacques Derrida. Some of that is because he's just like any sort of student going to a foreign city to try and study for a while. So I think that was part of it. But one of the things that became very clear when I studied him, went back into him, was his thought was incredibly consistent right throughout in his thesis and so forth. All right, he didn't call it deconstruction at that point. But I think he really did have a sense that he was coming from a different perspective. And of course, once you're a famous philosopher who can write your own papers on topics that you want, you're able to do that. You're able to just, you know, put forward what you want. But when he was a student trying to fit things into the box that you are a student, I think he panicked a lot. I think, you know, he had this sort of greatness inside him and was in a constant state of panic, kept failing exams. Again, that's a little bit of a tradition in that system. You know, it's not seen as terrible if you get 2 out of 20 or whatever it is on your first attempt. But so he was absorbing a lot of stuff, but also I think already the sort of ideas that would make him famous were starting to niggle away at him, and that kind of made him fitting into doing it traditional style became difficult. And right throughout his life, just being, as you say, a bit of an outsider, even though what he was doing was very much right in the center of philosophy.
Yeah, he becomes friends quite early with Louis Althusser, whose presence at the ENS was sort of as a kind of, you know, sort of intellectual gray eminence in a certain sense for so many students there throughout that time.
Yeah, I mean, it was a bit slightly more quotidian in lots of ways too. He was just the guy who looked after the students. So he was, you know, he was the lovely teacher who'd look after you. But as your viewers may know, Althusser was an incredibly complex man. And he and Derrida, I think, sort of swapped mentor roles several times. Althusser kept having breakdowns, basically. When he broke down, once Derrida was back working at ENS, Derrida would take his classes for him. And they had an incredibly complex filial relationship, and one that sort of, as you may know, ended in tragedy, in that Althusser murdered his wife. Derrida was there looking after him, and became quite a complex issue for Jacques Derrida, and of course for Althusser as well. So, but they were very close immediately. The first day he turned up at ENS, there's Louis Althusser saying, "Come here, young fella."
Yeah, and another sort of interesting thing about their relationship is, if you look at, I mean, the sort of France in '68, which is the kind of intellectual and sort of political nexus point of post-war French intellectual political life. Althusser kind of stands back from that and doesn't want to engage himself, and Derrida is maybe a little differently orientated.
Yeah, well, they both in a sense stood back. Derrida, sort of incongruence with his thought, I think, political commitment did not come easily to Derrida, as I'm sure we'll talk about. Althusser, it was much more complicated, and perhaps the opposite of what he should have been doing. I mean, Althusser, for better or worse, very much thought that any revolution should be worker-led, basically. And when this came out of the student body, it was quite unexpected for him, and it threw a lot of his theories into a fair bit of turmoil, I think. I'm simplifying terribly here, but it was quite confronting for him. And also, he was a fragile figure, and he did what all of us have done often, in stressful situations. He basically retired to his room and pulled the blankets over his head. So that was incredibly complicated. So although Derrida went on the '68 marches and all that sort of stuff, he also had problems committing to a course of action, because it was fundamental to his thinking that to commit to a course of action is to do a type of violence, and all of us who have, it's not bewildering to say that all of us who have committed to political action, you have to ignore a lot of stuff, don't you? The human mind is incredibly complex and incredibly subtle. When you commit to a course of action, you have to say, okay, I'm doing this now, I'm forgetting all my equivocations. Derrida really struggled with that, and tried harder later to not struggle with that, but it was so fundamental to his way of thinking that it was difficult.
Yeah, that's a key feature of his thinking. And also, in that moment, as I'm sure you're well aware, the sort of struggle going on surrounding Marxism at the ENS is one of the key features. And to a great extent, there's a way you can look at sort of Foucault, Derrida, some of these figures, more intellectually radical figures, are looking for a sort of mode of radicalism that's outside the normal channels of Marxism, which they feel like have become sort of clotted up and not allowing for a sort of sufficiently supple intellectual approach to the world.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, at ENS at that time, basically the student body was divided into the Catholics and the Marxists. Of course, this is just after World War II. And in a sense, both those factions, if you want to call them factions, were looking for grand ways to explain why the war happened, but also what the future might bring, and hope for the future. And these were competing. And the Stalinists, the Stals at ENS, did pressure Derrida a lot. And of course, Althusser was part of that, to try and join them. But one of the key differences with Derrida, of course, is he's Algerian. He's grown up in Algeria. Notoriously, the French Communist Party supported France against the Algerians for a very long time, and therefore they were a colonial power. The communists supported the colonial power, ironically, contradictorily, whatever. So for Derrida, it wasn't an easy choice. So forgetting all of the fact that he's Jacques Derrida, this young Algerian man being asked to become part of a communist party, which he knows is attacking the land he grew up in, is very, very difficult. So, I mean, I think he would have struggled anyway, but directly that had an impact, I think.
Sure, yeah. Well, let's jump back momentarily. So one of the interesting features of Derrida's intellectual development is that he starts out in the early years of his intellectual and professional development, engaging very extensively with the work of Edmund Husserl, which marks him out as very unusual. In those days, Husserl was didn't have quite the sort of cachet that he has now. And one reason that perhaps he does, in a way, is is Derrida's thesis, original thesis,
Yes.
his on the Genesis, on the concept of Genesis and Husserl, I believe it's called,
Yes.
and then the incredibly long and thorough introduction he writes to
Origin of Geometry. Yes.
Origins of Geometry,
which is a 15-page thing of Husserl's, which Derrida writes an introduction of 120 pages. He always wrote very long, Derrida, as I learned to my cost, basically.
Right. I mean, this is an interesting thing about Derrida, and we can talk about this a little bit more going forward, but that he really, he's an incredibly precise reader of text. And this is a sort of one of the kind of ironies of people, of the sort of, the sort of common view of Derrida, that he's this sort of loose writer who doesn't, live up to these sort of notional standards or whatever. But in fact, he's an incredibly precise reader of text, and sometimes so precise and thorough that he doesn't allow you a kind of linearity which will get you through to what he's trying to say.
Exactly. There were many times, you can imagine, as I was reading all 80 of his 400-page books, that I wished he was a little bit looser in his thinking. I wish he'd just take a break and give us 20 pages of relaxation. But yeah, he was an incredibly intense reader of a book. He said, "I only deconstruct books that I love." He had a love affair with reading. At a certain point, I think he said to Foucault, if I was just a reader, that is my actual talent. And I think in many ways it was. And Husserl was one of the people who he read intensely and very, very closely. And he wasn't unique at looking at Husserl at that time, but certainly in bringing him to public consciousness, Derrida was a huge part of that. And as you may know, as people may know, Husserl comes up with phenomenology, basically. And I think it's fair enough to say comes up with, it's always dangerous to say about thinking, but yeah, phenomenology is his thing, where he's essentially looking at philosophy and looking at the great question of philosophy, which is there a world? And Husserl says, we spend a lot of time trying to work out if there's a world, is there anything outside? Let's just park that question. Let's bracket it, he calls it. And let's describe how phenomena affect us. So if I look at a table, I don't want to know whether the table exists and so on, but I want to know what effect it has on me, and visual, verbal, smell, taste, touch, and so on. And very, very sophisticated. Derrida looked at this very closely and became obsessed with Husserl. He wrote for 10 years about Husserl, basically. As I've become obsessed with Husserl, I caution people, if you start reading him, you'll either hate him or you'll get really sucked in. But Derrida, when he talks about the genesis of Husserl, he's talking about the origin point. And he's saying that the problem with Husserl is you have this contradiction and you have this difficult aporia, as Derrida would call it, where if you want to stand there and look at the table, time continues to pass, for instance. So things keep changing. And Husserl tried to do time, but tried to wrestle it to the ground. So you can't find this original point where everything is still and you can make your judgment. That is not actually how we live, how we exist. Having sort of discovered this problem with Husserl, he then expanded that outward and saw it, and everyone may be familiar with the notion of metaphysics of presence, where Derrida said that philosophy has always had this reliance on this still point, this 0 point, this truth, it might be, or form, or so forth. And you can't actually get back to that. And this is something he does with language later. But this seeking of this thing in the past or in the future is false. But those things do hold system together. If you want me to sort of go on to that, for instance, truth in philosophy. Philosophy is held together by the idea of truth. Does truth exist? We can't actually prove it in the same way that religion can't prove there's a God. However, the idea of God generates religion. The idea of truth generates philosophy. So this is what he's doing, and he's doing it right back when he's in his early 20s, 12 years before he has any sort of fame, and then for the rest of his life, looking for these little contradictions, these aporias, where philosophy, for instance, is assuming truth where there isn't one, because that's actually what it's seeking.
Yeah, Husserl, there's a sort of interesting moment in the Prolegomena to the Logical Investigations in which he says that the real world just has a luminous certainty.
Yes.
And it's his way of getting past the sort of the Kantian division between the noumena and the phenomena, because we just have, we don't have to worry about resolving that problem.
Yeah, exactly.
We know when we see it.
Yeah, that's right. Yes, yep. And Husserl does have beautiful phrases like the flowing thisness is one that I'm continuing to be obsessed by. That's what we live in. We live in the flowing thisness. So yeah, it's thrilling stuff. But yeah.
But it's also interesting that so much of his project, so much of Husserl's project especially in the ideas and going forward than that, is how the meaning that's in my head gets into your head or other people's head. But Derrida takes that idea and pushes it so much further, especially not only in his engagement with Husserl, but also in his sort of subsequent engagement with Levinas, trying to sort of work out how this question of meaning can be resolved in the way we relate to the world and to other subjects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Levinas was a big influence on Derrida right throughout his life as well, and particularly ethically later. But Levinas's idea that Levinas takes Husserl and says, okay, we're encountering the world, but there's one thing in the world that we encounter completely differently to everything else, and that's another human being. Right. He describes this encounter as the face. And in a sense, our subjecthood is not constituted, we're not like a lighthouse that stands there and meaning radiates outwards. In fact, Levinas says, without others, capital O others, as well as lowercase, we have no subjectivity. If you imagine a world without other people, we would not be us in any way. Language is born of this encounter and so forth. And Derrida really took on that lesson that language and all of these things are a social thing caused by the encounter of another, and that is hugely important to him. And you mentioned Husserl with language, and this is kind of the other key insights that Derrida has, or one of the key insights, is that idea that throughout its history, philosophy has privileged language, that somehow language is the thing that is truth, that we have an idea in our head, we transform it into language, language comes out of me and goes to you, you take on that idea, and the idea exactly as I'd had it in my head is now in your head. And Husserl took this to the final sort of point where he said, even just saying the words makes them impure. The only pure, truthful language is just the inner monologue that I have. And Derrida took that to pieces, basically. The words I have in my head are not my own. When I speak, is it actually true that I have a thought and then I speak it? Well, actually, no. What I'm saying right now, including what I'm saying right now, I didn't think of. I did not have that thought in my head. So he takes that apart, but also diagnoses that happening throughout philosophy's history. That philosophy has always said that truth and language and the inner, the soul even, is the true thing. And as always privileged that overwriting, ironically, as Derrida puts it, although he doesn't say ironically, philosophy is written down. It is a written form, and yet it purports to be writing this truth. So yeah, very fascinating on that as well.
Well, I want to shift for a moment now to the kind of annus mirabilis of 1966-67 when Derrida sort of burst onto the world stage, first in the context of a colloquium on structuralism that's held at Johns Hopkins in 1966, and it's sort of vignette about this with which you start the book, I think, quite interestingly. So what is at stake in this conference that he attends, and how does his contribution affect what's going on there?
Yeah, to be honest, nothing very much was at stake. I mean, it's a terrific idea for a conference, that they are going to introduce structuralism, this voguish new form that's happening in France, to America. And Richard Maxey, who organizes it, gets a whole bunch of people. And the reason I started with it just is classically filmic. One person pulls out, who can we get? Oh, I know someone. There's this Jacques Derrida who's a teacher, and he's probably available because he's got nothing else on, which he didn't. He has no fame at this point. He's a lecturer at ANS. He comes over. He's the last speaker because they just fit him in at the end. And basically, he spends his half hour taking apart structuralism. In some of the terms I was just talking about, structuralism says that in order to understand something, in order to what something means, a text, for instance, you look at where it fits in a structure. So you can't just say it exists in itself. It's part of a whole structure. Derrida says, okay, that's fine. Okay, that works. However, again, like I was saying before, the thing that guarantees the structure, the center he called it at this point, but would later say it was kind of outside the structure, can't be part of the structure. So you go back to God and religion. Religion, Levi-Strauss and so forth, myths, all of these things that keep the structure going. The thing that guarantees it is God. Now, if God becomes part of the structure, everything ends. If God arrives tomorrow, there's no more religion. If truth arrives tomorrow, there's no more philosophy. Language, the Bible says, in the beginning was the word, as though there's a single word that we could get back to. Derrida says, no, there's no single word we can get back to. So basically, he takes apart structuralism to the point where the people who were there said at the time, structuralism just died. One of the earlier lecturers there said, this is my life's work, and it's done now. So, right, what shall I do next? And it was just this, hugely filmic thing that he does this and is catapulted into fame, and then produces the three books, which I'm sure we'll sort of move on to next. So.
Yeah, so in 1967, he publishes Writing Indifference, Speech and Phenomena, and Of Grammatology, three absolutely crucial texts in modern continental philosophy. Three texts probably more important than the vast majority of workers in the field will produce one text in the course of their working lives. And I just want to... this is one of my absolute favorite passages in the book. I quoted this in the review, but I think it's worth repeating. Of Grammatology is a gloriously bonkers book and the founding text of deconstruction. It is also many other things. It is the text of the philosophy of writing, the grammatology of its title. It is also a sustained reading of the works of Rousseau and through him, the history of language. It puzzles over hieroglyphics. It analyzes the Chinese alphabet. It ranges across Levi-Strauss, Heidegger, Leibniz, Condillac. The reference list alone contains over 1,000 titles, some obscure beyond belief. Its most celebrated chapter occurs in quotation marks within an ellipsis, that dangerous supplement. It discusses masturbation at some length, Rousseau's in particular, comparing it to the act of writing. It is exorbitant. It is hyperbolic. It plows forward. It obfuscates. It bursts at the seams with the profusion of its ideas. And I think that is perhaps the greatest sort of description of Derrida's writing writ large that I've ever seen. I mean, it's just...
Thank you.
It's almost too interesting to read a lot of the time because you get sort of caught up in the sort of pathways that he keeps following through texts.
Absolutely, yes, yeah. I mean, I was very pleased with Gloriously Bonkers. That was taken in and out of the text. I was fighting for it because, I mean, going back to grammatology, because I remember difficulty of reading it at the time. Well, let's be honest, pretending to read it at the time when I was doing philosophy. And I was trying to read it again this time, and I was still going, this is just very, very hard to read, apart from anything else. Not just paragraph by paragraph, but the actual the arc of the book. And I suddenly went, well, the reason it's hard to read is it's bonkers, isn't it? I mean, he's just shoving in all of this stuff from all different angles. And it was a book that came out of an essay, and it was an essay kind of tacked on to another book he was writing and all that sort of stuff. So it doesn't actually have a through line in some senses. But it's just this profusion of ideas that are going on, and he's talking very quickly because he's overexcited, I think. And there's a beautiful clip of him on YouTube where he's talking about him and his wife Marguerite, that they were in Venice and they were about to go on the Vaporetto, and he had to pull her aside and said, "Look, I think I've discovered this lever in philosophy, and if I get this right, then I think this changes everything." Obviously, you can't imagine the level of fame he reaches, because why would you? But so he's really excited by this thing, and it also affects the way he writes. I mean, this is one of the things about Derrida. I mean, he can just be really difficult to read because he's off on one. He'll go with a pun and just flog it to death. But in saying that language and that meaning is in quotation marks, he has to write like that too. And grammatology, I think, is him really working out how to write in a style that he will later write much more easily and much more flowing. But it's the sort of book where you can just pick it up on page 68 and go, right, I'm going to read this page. Well, you can pick it up on page 312 and I'm going to read this page. And the ideas that bounce off there are quite astonishing, I think.
Yeah, people often talk about the concept of parataxis in the way that Theodor Adorno, especially sort of in his later writings, the aesthetic theory, for instance, had this sort of non-linear quality. But Derrida takes that to a whole other zip code. I mean, it's really
absolutely
quite startling.
And ironically, in some senses, I mean, this is the man who dedicates his life, in a sense, to pointing out how all texts have these competing voices. They're not wholes, they're not coherent in that sense. And here he is producing something that's incoherent in many ways, you know, that
Right.
has many contradictions and all that he's in a sense accusing others of, but kind of knowingly, you know, this is he takes it to an extreme later in books like Glass, where he does have columns and different stuff.
Right, he has two
Yeah,
texts going on at the same time.
yeah, absolutely, yeah. But what he's arguing is that all texts do this. You know, he's visually representing what all texts do. But in of grammatology, he hadn't reached that point quite yet. He was still just like everything he could possibly think of, he's putting down on the page pretty much.
Right. He writes in Of Grammatology, this question is therefore not only of Rousseau's writing, but also of our reading. The reader writes in a language and in a logic whose proper system, laws, and life, his discourse by definition cannot dominate absolutely. Reading cannot legitimately transgress the text towards something other than it. There is nothing outside of the text. And
Yes.
this last line is one of his sort of paradigmatic statements, one that's sort of thrown back at him and other post-structuralists by people, especially in the analytic tradition, for engaging in a kind of relativism, or trying to sort of say that texts are the only thing, and that anything else is just sort of ephemeral or illusory or what have you.
Yeah, absolutely. Which it's not doing. I mean, it's a slight mistranslation. It should really say there is no outside text. Right. So it's essentially saying, well, the first thing that passage is saying is that you can't, as a reader, just decide the book is anything. You know, it's a dialogue with a book, isn't it? The reader can't say the book means something completely different to what the text is doing. And that's one of the accusations that's been hurled at him, that, you know, you can read a book and say it's about anything, or, you know, it has any meaning. So he's saying you have to engage with it. But he's also saying what you engage with is the book, is the stuff between those covers, in a sense. And whenever I'm trying to get my head around that, I think of a later book that he wrote, Politics of Friendship. And in it, he riffs on a passage from Aristotle, a phrase of Aristotle's, "O friends, there is no friend," which is actually a quotation of Montaigne of Aristotle. "O friend, there is no friend." Now, that's a baffling, strange sentence. What Derrida says is you have to take it that's meant. It means that. There is no outside text. You can't look around and go, oh, it's a mistranslation. We need to say, oh, my friend, there is in some cases no friends that we are. No, oh, friend, there is no friend. So that's what he's talking about when he's saying that. He's saying when you encounter a text, you read it. You don't flail about making stuff up, which is, in fact, pretty much the opposite of what he's been accused of. And there is no outside text. You have to read that text, and you have to read it thoroughly in order to work out what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's you know, a key thing that he really wants to say. It's not that there are no rules. It's that you have to read them out of what it is that you're engaging with. He says at the beginning of, I think this is from the beginning of Plato's Pharmacy, a text is not a text unless it hides from the first comer, from the first glance, the law of its composition and the rules of its game. And that's what you're engaged in doing when you're reading, is you're learning what it wants to tell you, not imposing what you want it to tell you on it.
Exactly. And I always like to try and bring Derrida back to normalcy, as it were, you know, to view him as a philosopher. And one of the things I really wanted to do in the book was think of him as a philosopher, but also as a human being thinking. And also, he always saw himself as a phenomenologist, you know, and that was one of the key moments where I went, oh, this is what he's doing. You know, he wanted to actually describe how life is, which all philosophers purport to do. And when we're reading, I think the things that Derrida goes to great pains to analyze is actually what we do. You know, when we're reading a book, we don't bite it off in one chew. We put it down, we come back to it, our views change. If we read it again, we might get different meanings from it, all of those things. Literary criticism, philosophy have had this kind of pretense that you can come up with the meaning of a book. You can say this is what it's about. It's notorious with poetry, isn't it? That people will say, what does this poem mean? As though it's a complete accident or an unfortunate thing that the poet had to use poetry to convey meaning. We can actually get to the meaning behind this. So when we're reading a book, we actually, I think, do the things that Derrida says we're doing. You know, it says it's in hiding to begin with. Yeah, that's right. As you muddle your way through a book, you are getting to what it might mean. You are getting to the different meanings of it. You don't have this whole idea, you know. And it's like if you read a film review and then go and see a film, you know, having read the film review, you've imposed a meaning. But if you see a film by accident, or, you know, you just go to see something you've never heard of, or you haven't read it, it unfolds in front of you, it changes meaning and all that stuff. That's actually how we encounter most art. And Derrida was very much trying to analyze what it's actually like to be alive. And as he says beautifully at one point, you know, if life was simple, word would have gotten around. And
right. But that's, you know, this too, I think is, you know, there's a lot of sort of mysticism or accusations of mysticism around his concept of deference. Some people, yes, I think, mispronounce it, like, because in a way so that they don't understand it. But if you just say it as deference, you really get to his idea about it, which is that what we have to do is not be in this sort of imposing position, but we have we have to engage in an actual reading that looks at what's there as opposed to what we choose to put there.
Absolutely. I mean, in a basic sense, it's the moment before decision, isn't it? Whatever the situation. He's mostly talking about language when he uses that word. It's the moment before we put a name on something. So we're trying to get back. And the slippery thing about it is it's not a concept. It's not a thing. And this is one of the other reasons that Derrida is quite difficult to read, and was no doubt difficult to write. That he has this phrase hauntology, which is in French is a much closer homonym of ontology. So philosophy, all of the disciplines have looked at things, looked at objects all the time. He wants to look at the moment before there's objects, or the moment, what happens between objects or absent objects. And difference is that moment just before anything's decided, which again is how we live. You know, in many ways, not completely, but we are not always in a world of imposing names on objects and things, including emotions and so forth. You know, that is actually how it is to be alive.
Right. Yeah. So just to sort of shift gears slightly, you know, Derrida becomes or Derrida. I'm always wondering, is it meant to be Derrida? Is it meant to be Derrida?
I just always go with whatever the last person said, basically. So.
Because then they know who you mean.
Yeah.
But
let's go with Derrida.
Right. That's the common pronunciation. Let's just swing with it.
Yes. Okay.
But so as the sort of 80s go on, he's become sort of enmeshed in a number of real world intellectual conflicts, if you want to call it that. So I believe it's 87, Victor Farias, Heidegger and Nazism comes out. Derrida is associated, not, I think, entirely justly with the modern appropriation of Heidegger. I think that I mean, he wrote of Spirit, but there are other people who I think are much more Jean-Luc Nancy and others who were more, you know, more deeply involved with Heidegger. But the question then becomes, and then sort of on the heels of that is the controversy over Paul de Man. And his association with Nazism, and also the fact that he turned out to be kind of a charlatan in a lot of ways. But so Derrida, you know, how does he relate to these sort of controversies?
Well, I think there's a few things going on. Just to revisit them slightly. Heidegger, I mean, everyone will know about the sort of Nazism. Derrida had the misfortune to have a book of his of Spirit come out at the same time as a large book about Heidegger's Nazism, which was then taken as a response to that book. And Derrida's book is very Derridian. You know, it's exploring the word spirit in Heidegger, how it changes, how it moves, how, you know, it was avoided in, you know, it's a great German tradition, of course, talking about spirit, Hegelian, so forth. Heidegger avoids using the word in Being and Time, and then suddenly, when he, you know, he's giving his speeches and National Socialist spirit is there in big, you know, capital letters, blah, blah, blah. So Derrida's exploring that. What was needed at the time, because this new book had come out about Heidegger's association with the Nazis, was, you know, saying, yeah, Heidegger's a bastard, basically. That's what people wanted. Derrida didn't do that. But closer to home, the Paul de Man controversy, for those who may not know, de Man was probably Derrida's closest intellectual friend, I think. And also, in my opinion, probably the most brilliant of the Derridians, you know, in taking Derrida's ideas and using them, but also being incredibly original in his own thinking about rhetoric and so on. They talk on the phone a few times a week. The man dies. Derrida gives a moving eulogy at his funeral. All good. Then it comes out that the man had written for a Nazi newspaper in the 42, 43, and then had left. Initially, that's okay. Yeah, but for the grace of God go I. He obviously left because he's such a terrific guy. You know. Turns out he was kicked out of the Nazi newspaper for ethical reasons, which is quite an achievement, of course.
Right.
And he then leaves Belgium, having set up a few shell companies for publishing and getting lots of money and never producing anything. Moves to America, remarries, even though he's still married, so he's a bigamist. He fakes up a whole load of intellectual papers and gets into university on that. So it's basically, he's a charlatan. And all of this gradually and then rapidly comes out. And Derrida tried to defend the man, which was a mistake. And I'm a bit hard on Derrida at this point because I think for me, it's the worst paper he wrote, trying to defend Paul de Man, basically saying it must have been horrible being him doing all of this. I accept all those problems, but geez, it must have been horrible being Paul de Man. Now, that's the sort of thing to write in a couple of 100 years' time, I think. You don't write it immediately afterwards. But it was, the thing you can forgive him is that it was a gesture of friendship, and friendship was this hugely important thing for Derrida. He was looking after a mate, but also incredibly complex stuff going on. And Derrida, as a man, I think, took this on. The other thing that's happening, of course, is he's now world famous, which, 10 years ago, he's writing papers on Husserl no one's heard of. Sorry, 20 years ago, writing papers on Husserl no one's heard of. Now he's the most famous philosopher in the world. He's part of popular culture. And he's hammered for this because, of course, as with today, the thing he's accused of is lying, of falseness, post-truth, that there is no truth. Suddenly, his best mate has been lying for 40 years because he was a Nazi. And basically that's seen as not only do you attack de Man, not only do you attack Derrida, but you attack deconstruction. Deconstruction says there's no truth. And what Derrida does in response, I think, is quite brilliant. He starts to look at ethical issues. He starts to talk about justice and about law. Now, all of this, he says, was in deconstruction all along. And if you read back, yes, it was. But he didn't have to make that move. He didn't have to take it into that realm. And I really think that the things that happened to him took him to there. He really wanted to know what was going on and take an ethical position. Because if you're saying your philosophy is in a sense like Levinas, based on an ethics, and it fails this massive test, which it did, he then has to re-explore his own foundations, I think, which is what he did sort of in the 90s and 2000s.
Yeah, so I said in the review that it would have been sort of interesting to talk about his response to the Sokol affair, the Sokol hoax. And when we were sort of exchanging communications afterward, you said no, it wouldn't, which I think is fine in the sense that, I mean, I don't think that the Sokol thing is very interesting. I mean, it's a kind of an intellectual cheap shot. Social text obviously should have had people reffing their contributions or whatever.
It was what you said. I left it out, which you said me leaving it out was interesting, and it wasn't actually. It was like I got too many words. I have to cut something.
But what I think is interesting is what Derrida says. He was asked for a comment about it by Le Monde, and he says, "This is all rather sad, don't you think? For poor Sokol to begin with, his name remains linked to the hoax, the Sokol hoax, as they say in the United States, and not to his scientific work." Sad too, because the chance of serious reflection seems to have been ruined, at least in a broad public forum that deserves better. It would have been interesting to make a scrupulous study of the so-called scientific metaphors, their role, their status, their effects in the discourses that are under attack, not only in the case of the French, and not only in the case of these French writers. That would have required that a certain number of difficult discourses be read seriously in terms of their theoretical effects and strategies. That was not done. And then he says later, and I think that this is really a sort of key comment that he makes, as for the relativism they're supposed to be worried about, well, even this word has a rigorous philosophical meaning. Even if this word has a rigorous philosophical meaning, there is not a trace of it in my writing, nor of a critique of reason and the Enlightenment. Quite the contrary. But what I do take more seriously is that the wider context, the American context and the political context, that we can't begin to approach here, given the limits of space, and also the theoretical issues have been so badly dealt with.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, there's lots of stuff going on there, isn't it? I mean, it's a brilliant paper, I think. I mean, the first thing to say is Sokol had written a false paper, basically using all the kind of postmodern tropes he possibly could to write a piece of nonsense, which was accepted for in a journal. The first thing to say is that there was a lot of bad Derrida going around. I think it's worth acknowledging that. I think one of the problems with Derrida, and he's not exclusive in this. You know, in writing the biography, I had to go back and read some Hegel. Reading the people around Hegel was just terrible. It was really torturous.
Yeah.
So there was a lot of bad Derrida going on, and you know, taking the idea of deconstruction and going, okay, I'm going to analyze, you know, the color red in this novel and take apart the entire novel. And so that was going on. So Sokal had some sort of point. But the accusation of relativism, again, I think it's useful to take this back to how we all actually live. And this is to do with post-truth as well, and truth. What Derrida was doing originally was looking at the philosophical truth, just very, very narrowly going, okay, this word truth in philosophy has this function. And we can take it to pieces. You know, we can't prove it exists, we can't prove it doesn't exist, all those things, but we can watch how it functions, what it does. Very like Wittgenstein, where he says to look at the meaning of a word, look at how it's used. So what is this word truth doing? All of us, I think, live in different truth registers, don't we, in our day-to-day life? We don't even notice we're doing it. You know, if I'm reading a novel and I see something and I go, oh, that's very true, how true, I might write in margins. That's fantastic. If I then go and read Principia Mathematica, or I do some quadratic equations, or I have a chat with a friend about, their boyfriend's no good sort of thing, I switch between these different types of truths. I don't say to my friend who's saying their boyfriend's a bastard, well, hang on, actually, I've read Principia Mathematica, and what you're saying is not true because Bertrand Russell proves this, this, and this. So we shift between these types of truths all the time, and we construct different truths all the time. And the kind of notorious example for post-truth was, of course, the Sean Spicer saying, there were more people for Donald Trump than there were for Barack Obama. The truth he's appealing to is maths. And, unless he wants to rewrite maths, then maths does have this system of truth which says, no, there weren't, mate. I'm sorry about that. So what he's saying, he's not being relativistic at all. He's merely saying that these truths are constructed and they work in different ways in different times. Is there a truth? I don't know. But, is there a God? I don't know. But that's not to throw out all of philosophy. It's not to throw out all of thinking. It's not to throw out all of religion. It's to say that we don't know. So we need to explore and keep coming back and exploring.
Yeah, the fact that it's unresolved is the thing that makes it interesting.
Absolutely, and if it was resolved tomorrow, then that's the end of philosophy.
Right. I mean, this is the problem that analytic philosophy has, because they're so obsessed with proving that 2 + 2 = 4 that the table next to me exists. And I mean, I think this is a kind of interesting moment that Heidegger, at a certain point, I think it's in one of his early lecture courses, maybe the hermeneutics of facticity, says, I think he talks about the whole problem of other minds. And he's just incensed by this, because is this a problem that people really have? No, they do not. And this is, Derrida, I think one of the reasons why, and we can get to this, I think, right now, why is he relevant for us today, is that what he's saying is, what are the problems that we have with meaning, and what are the problems that we have with truth, and how can we work through those rather than just sort of specifying, okay, X = X, and we're going to move on now.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, Derrida had a respect for analytic philosophy. He thought good work was happening. And again, I'm just stepping back. He's not trying to get rid of philosophy or say philosophy doesn't work. He's saying it does work, and isn't it magnificent? Literature works, isn't it magnificent? Religion works, isn't it magnificent? All those things are sometimes not magnificent as well, but he'd obviously rather they were still being generated than not being generated. Your example of Heidegger is absolutely spot on, and this is exactly what we were talking about with Husserl, wasn't it? That Husserl said, day to day, we don't really worry whether there's a world at all. If we're doing philosophy, we might think about it. Heidegger might say, if we're doing philosophy, we might think about other minds, but it's not a thought that will occur to you, except occasionally. And Derrida, like those two, is saying, yes, there's a philosophical way of thinking, but it's a way of thinking. It's a narrative. It's a way of going on. It's not actually how we live day to day. And certainly, I think the whole post-truth thing, which Derrida tends to get accused of, and his followers tend to get accused of, without actually saying anything, vaguely similar to that. It's a very easy way to say, they did this. They believe everything is relative, whereas it's very hard to find anyone on the Derridian side, if you want to call it, who's ever argued that. And
right, yeah. I mean, it's it's one thing to sort of to look at his work and say it has, like, let's read it closely and it has this problem or that problem.
Yeah.
It's another to sort of to talk to someone who's read it, or
Yes.
read sort of like summations, especially those written by people generally speaking hostile to it, who themselves may not have read it or devoted a great deal of time
Absolutely.
to it.
And I do think that there's been kind of, you know, insofar as there's a Derrida controversy, there's been faults on both sides, as in any controversy. But you know, Derrida does have the difficulty that he's difficult to read. And you know, if you follow sort of social media Derrida, as it were, there's a couple of things that happen. One is he's blamed for post-truth, but also he's this kind of code word for something that's really complicated. You know, people will say it's all gone a bit Derrida, or, you know, I feel a bit Derrida-ish, you know, I'm right. And that stops all conversation, of course. Now, that's fun in lots of ways, but I really feel it kind of stops conversations between intellectual people as well, people who can actually get their heads around it on both sides of the debate. They kind of go, too hard, so I'll just use the code word. And it was something he was very aware of, that he was becoming a trope, as it were. And it does shut down conversation. And that's really why I wanted to go back and look at him as a philosopher and just go, he's not just this mad sort of mystic person coming up with bizarre language. He's really thought through stuff through, and he has really thought stuff through. So as many people have on both sides.
Okay, so there's a lot in the book that we haven't had time to touch on, but there is one thing that I want to sort of get to, sort of by way of finishing, and it's this. I want to introduce it with this is a section from a speech that Theodor Adorno delivered at the Free University of Berlin on the 125th anniversary of Hegel's death, in which he says, a historical occasion like the 125th anniversary of Hegel's death could have elicited what we call an appreciation, but that concept has become untenable, if indeed it ever had any value. It makes the impudent claim that because one has the dubious good fortune to live later, and because one has a professional interest in the person one is to talk about, one can sovereignly assign the dead person his place, thereby in some sense elevating oneself above him. This arrogance echoes in the loathsome question of what in Kant, and now Hegel as well, has any meaning for the present. And even the so-called Hegel Renaissance began half a century ago with a book by Benedetto Croce that undertook to distinguish between what was living and what was dead in Hegel. The converse question is not even raised. What the present means in the face of Hegel. And I think that's an interesting question to ask about Hegel, but I think it's a really interesting question to ask about Derrida. What does the current moment mean in the face of Derrida's thought and Derrida's writing?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, we've touched on some of it, haven't we, with post-truth? And the first thing to say is what a great quote that is. I mean, we do. I mean, I think for Derrida and for Levin, it makes me think of Levinas as well. We shouldn't have this Hegelian, in fact, sort of notion of history is going up onwards and upwards and onwards and upwards, this positivist idea that, you know, all of these ideas jostle with each other and will continue to jostle with each other, and in a sense it's a sort of vertical thing rather than, you know, this horizontal thing going up. But I mean, going back to Derrida now, I think you really do get a sense of these ideas of meaning, which I think many of us, perhaps, although there were people who were more sort of intellectually powerful than me, we kind of settled into a bit of meaning being set, didn't we? That almost even those of us who resisted the idea of the end of history, kind of it was there in the background somehow, that, you know, whatever was going on and whatever terrible things were happening in the West, I'm bracketing, that there was sort of this overarching narrative. And certainly the last few years have thrown that into complete disarray, haven't they? Not just for people thinking hard about it, and not just for people who are incredibly politically active, but for all of us. You know, stuff like intersubjectivity, you know, and you know, the whole question of identity, which Derrida, and we haven't really touched on it, being a Jew living in Algeria, learning French, he was at this intersection of so many different identity types, and they really did inform him. But for all of us, that's become a question. You know, I'm a white heterosexual male in my mid-40s. No, I'm 50. I've just turned 50. Describe that. You know, I have been the kind of the norm, haven't I, for history, without ever having to question myself in many, many ways. And I'm talking about where we are now, sort of Western democracy, blah, blah. That has been the norm. Now, whereas people who aren't all of those things have had to be the other, have had to think about themselves, have had to think about what they write and so on. Someone like me hasn't had to. I can just speak from the mountain. But now even someone like me, who's, you know, if I check my privileges at the door, I'm going to be out there for a very long time. I have to consider that stuff. And this is something that Derrida picked up on very early, and it's really playing out now, isn't it, for good and bad and all of those things, all of those questions. And I think they are deeply part of Derrida. And I think he, you know, he is helping us work through those, and he can help us work through those. He can't necessarily give us a decision. You know, we may have to do that ourselves. But for me, that's the other incredibly interesting thing that's happening when you read back to Derrida, that many of the things he's talking about are things that are happening right now that he predicted is the wrong word, but they were issues for him at the time and didn't need to be necessarily.
Right. I mean, I think that one of the interesting things about philosophy, and maybe this relates to Derrida par excellence, is that it doesn't, people want to look at philosophy and say, well, can it, you know, what answers can it provide for me? And the answer to the question is none, really, but it can help you frame the question so that you can come to a sort of a way of understanding it. And maybe that's really what Derrida wants us to try and do.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, all great philosophy, it does, doesn't it? It makes us question the bases of our knowledge. That's the job of it. You know, whether it's Plato, whether it's Hegel, whether it's Derrida. You know, some, you know, in a sense, imposing a meaning is a form of totalitarianism, isn't it? You know, and that's something that Derrida very much resisted. But, you know, the basic phrase is just not quite as simple as that. I think it's a bit more complicated than that. And anytime you are thinking something through, to realize it's more complicated, and gee, Derrida makes it complicated, it gives you a space to do your own thinking in a sense, because a lot of what we think on a day-to-day basis is inherited, isn't it? It's the norm, it's the culture that you actually step back from that and say, well, hang on, actually, that's not what I believe, not what I think. I need some tools to break this down. I think Derrida is very good. It's very hard to read Derrida and not come out thinking a bit differently. Now, some of that thinking differently might be, Jesus, is terrible and hard, and I'm not going to go near it. But, you know, if you engage with him, it will change things, I think.
All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Once again, the book is An Event, Perhaps, a biography of Jacques Derrida. It's out on Verso Books. Thank you so much, Peter Salmon. That was a really interesting topic.
Thanks, John. Really, really enjoyed it.